All right, everyone, welcome back to Getting In, a College Coach Conversation. We're now getting over to the finance corner of our show for today and talking a little bit about what seniors need to think about as they head into this enrollment deposit season. And joining me to do that with his second appearance on the podcast is one of our newer educators, former financial aid officer from Loras College. We've got Zach. Is it Grease or it's Grease, right?
Greece, yeah, similar to the country, spelled differently.
Similar to the country. All right, perfect. So we're gonna do this in English. We're not doing it in Greek. Okay.
Yeah.
Although sometimes, and here's a terrible dad joke for you. Sometimes finance conversations are Greek to me. Okay. So Zach, thanks for being here. I'm sorry
You're
about
so
that.
welcome.
So we just talked a little bit about some of the things that seniors need to think about as they head through this phase on the admission side. And now we want to talk a little bit about financial aid. Now, the decisions have come back. They've gotten offers of financial aid. They're probably starting to communicate in terms of their enrollment deposits. Is there anything that students need to do with respect to financial aid at this point in the late spring of this process?
That's a really good question. And I'll answer it with some general principles and then some ideas that may help a family really be thorough in checking their own personal checklist, if you want to think of it that way as well.
Yeah, that's great.
But, generally speaking, at the time we're at now, or most of our listeners may be at, where they've got their financial aid offer letters and they're either deciding or they've already recently decided. At some point in this journey, it's not uncommon for colleges to shift their method of communication from personal emails, personal accounts that a student would have had when they started the application process, to a more formal account, maybe the school's email system.
Okay.
And so one of the suggestions I think is really valuable for families and students to keep in mind, no matter where they're at in this decision process, is, be aware that there will be that change in communication pathway. Some colleges may do that change once a family attends orientation. Other colleges may be closer to the start of the fall, but be thinking that way. And just make sure in both cases, whether it's a personal email or a school email, that students are checking it periodically. The worst thing that happens is a school messages a student and it gets missed or lost in multiple emails that might be received at this point. So
Gotcha.
That's one general tip. If you're at all unsure when that transition will happen, and an absolutely great question to ask the college if you're looking for more of a personal tip to really see this through. So that would be one item I've got and I thought would be valuable to mention. The second item I thought I would mention is generally from the financial aid perspective, colleges, you can think of a college's role through this process as kind of creating a checklist. They've got, you want to submit a FAFSA or a CSS profile. If you use CSS, you may have to submit documents via the iDoc system.
Okay.
FAFSA may have some other steps. And so the college's role is to help you manage all of those steps. And if you're at all unsure if you've finished those steps, that's another good thing to be thinking about now that you're making your decision. And you can do that one of two ways. Again, it would be a great question to ask the college, either their admissions staff or their financial aid staff, or some colleges may have an online checklist in your admissions portal where you can sign in and see, just for your own peace of mind, that you've done everything that's needed at this point in time. So I thought those would be two helpful steps, no matter where students are going, to be thinking about as they're trying to firm up and finish up this process.
Now, there are two communication channels. Typically, you've got a college that's communicating sometimes with students and sometimes with parents. And often you have parents that are handling some of the strategy around paying for college. Maybe they're paying the bill. You've got students that are starting to think about, what is my dorm going to be? How do I register for classes? And those kinds of conversations. Where does the communication typically go? And how can parents and students get on the same page in terms of sharing information that either of them has received individually, but is intended for them collectively to try and solve?
That's a great point. What I noticed and observed when I was a financial aid director is that the default recipient of messages was the student.
Mhm.
And during the student's senior year, when they're in high school, it wasn't uncommon to have some different chains of communication that were going to parents to help them understand when something went to the student that was worthwhile for the parents and the student to collaborate on. That might not be the case at all colleges, but I think in that admissions journey, when you're a senior in high school through your enrollment decision, you could reasonably expect that colleges are communicating to both parents and students quite equally and transparently. What I think is worth understanding as a parent and maybe changing your strategy a little bit is that at some point the school will likely interpret the student as an adult, in the sense that there are, similarly to if you go to a medical provider, the medical provider can't provide your health
Right.
records with others.
Right.
Colleges are unable to provide educational records with others, including your parents, unless a student has given them authorization as an adult. And so at that point, it really does shift to the student's responsibility. And if parents are really worried that, maybe their son or daughter isn't going to communicate with them or doesn't understand what types of messages to communicate, to your point, the billing and the financial aid type of messages, I think it's really savvy for parents to maybe have weekly meetings or sit down with their child at dinner once a week and just collaborate on that, and really use this next few months before the student arrives to college as a chance to iron out some of those formalities between what are you going to send and when and why, and can we just make sure you're understanding that as a student who's going to need to provide us with information.
That's right. I remember being in the community safety office for an unrelated reason. And I was listening to the community safety officer sort of saying, well, we can't go knock on his door. He's an adult. It's like mom was calling to be like, my son isn't responding to my phone calls. Can you go talk to him? And they're like, no, he's an adult at this point. Like, I'm sorry that he's not responding to your calls, but there's nothing we can do. When it comes to the financial aid piece, I think it is a good idea to be on the same page, but maybe also want to talk about how regularly you're going to have those check-in family calls during the school year. So we've figured out some of the logistical sides of how to handle this communication, but I think that there's also this big question of, well, how are we going to pay for this? What does the actual strategy look like? And I think that's probably something that a lot of families have started to think about. It's something that I'm thinking about even as a parent of a 9 and an 8-year-old, but now it's starting to get real. What are we looking at in terms of starting to identify the strategy of paying for college? What are the different components that we want to assess and see how they're going to contribute overall?
Great question. So I think, the benefit of this time, being April, when your students have likely made their decisions or they're down to 1 or 2 colleges, is that for the first time, likely in quite a long period of time, families can really make some pretty school-specific strategies.
Yeah.
When you're considering 10 colleges, you can't make a specific strategy to 10 colleges because there's so much you don't know and there's so much variance. This is a really good time to assemble some tools and make some school-specific strategies for that reason.
Yeah.
When I refer to tools, there's a couple things that I think families will really want to kind of amass in front of them and then start to depict it from there. So, for example, if they have a financial aid offer letter that spells out both the costs to the institution that a family is going to pay directly and the costs that are incurred outside of the institution, those two pieces of information are really valuable. So if a family is feeling like they don't have either of those numbers, that would be a great place to start, is to collect them. Most families on their financial aid offer letter will see both of those pieces of data. Secondarily, once a family has looked over their costs and they've understood what scholarships and grants, if any, can be used to offset them, the family will want to calculate whatever balance they anticipate needing to pay.
Right.
We refer to that in the financial aid world as a net cost. So the difference between the gross cost and your scholarships and grants. And once you've got your net cost, you can really start to strategize with a particular school around things like, are we going to take the federal direct subsidized or unsubsidized student loans? If we are, can we pay the rest with cash or 529 accounts or savings? And if we don't have that amassed yet, can we rely on a payment plan at the college to make monthly payments for some of these costs? And if we can't do that, what are we thinking we could cover with those methods, with the hopes that if you have to borrow a secondary option, you're minimizing that secondary borrowing by using what resources you do have. So that method allows you to really work through this conversation quite a bit and make a school specific strategy. And I think that could be a really nice thing to do at this point in time.
So, and some of the things that you just mentioned, payment plans and loans are great topics that we've explored in the past on this show.
Great.
So people can dive into our archives and have a look at some of those past conversations if they're curious about any of that stuff. But Zach, at what point do we start thinking about, we've got a gap in our strategy. Let's say the net cost to us is going to be X, but we really only think we can afford to pay X minus Y. How do we find out how to actually support that Y? I mean, this is an important cost. It might be something that's hard for us to come up with. What are the sources that we can look into, aside from just hoping that we win the lottery?
Yes, I will hope that all of our listeners win the lottery.
That would be great.
It would be great.
Listen to the show, win the lottery. I wish we could make that happen.
I'll hope, Ian, that you win the lottery.
That's great. I would have to play it, but yeah,
right.
I do hope that
for your 8 and 9 year olds.
That's right.
Yeah. So now, if that doesn't come true, and if our hope goes out into the void, and families don't happen to win, they're usually at this point in time, there's a family could plan on some kind of an educational loan. If there was a gap between their cash flow and their savings, and they said we're still about 10,000 short, that would be a great place to then say, okay, we should plan on some kind of a secondary loan. Worst case scenario. Now, at some point, a family may need to put in a loan application and secure that. However, before doing so, some other strategies a family could employ, even at this point in time, would be things like outside scholarships. They might entertain some kind of a appeal or negotiation to the college to help them solve an affordability problem. So there's a couple other things a family could do that they may not be able to count on. It may not be an explicit part of their strategy yet, but that you could employ now to try and make sure that when and if you choose to borrow a secondary loan, you're really making that as small as possible.
Gotcha. So strategies to minimize any kind of a secondary loan, because that comes with expectations later on down the road in terms of how you pay it, the interest accrues, et cetera. So let's see what else we can do in the meantime.
Absolutely.
Great. I mean, it's not a decision and a conversation that I am looking forward to, but I am glad that I will have the experts at College Coach to help when that happens. Zach, thanks for coming on the show and helping us out here.
Thanks so much. Best wishes to everybody.
Appreciate it. So that's going to do it for today's show. Everyone, really want to thank you all for being here. Give you a little reminder to leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast, but especially if you listen to it on iTunes. And we are going to be back next week. I'll be hosting, and I'm going to be talking to Beth Heaton's son, Jack, to talk a little bit about his college search and the decisions. And we're going to talk all about whether his mom was tolerable in the process or not. I'm just kidding. Of course, she was wonderful. And we'll talk a little bit about waitlist strategies and what to do at this phase in the process. And finally, in the post-tax season, are there some tax advantage ways that we can start to save for college heading down into the future? So we'll see you next week. Looking forward to the next episode. Until then, have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.